Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the war on the home front in the United States. In our last section we talked about how the United States enters World War II with the attack on Pearl Harbor. But what was happening at home? Well, one of the big things that happened at home was Executive Order 9066, and this happened on February 19th of 1942. What this executive order did was that it required about 120,000 Japanese Americans to leave their homes and be put into relocation camps. These are going to be Japanese Americans that are along the western coast. This included children and the elderly. They were issued the order. They had no choice in the matter. These are going to be people who were citizens in the United States, including the children of immigrants, children who had been born in the United States, who were Japanese Americans. It wasn't because they had done anything wrong. It wasn't because there were any watches out on them. It was simply because they were Japanese Americans. You might be wondering now why the U.S. would do this. How could they do something like that? The government will say that they are doing this to keep the United States safe, even though it was a violation of the civil rights of the Japanese Americans at the time. In these relocation camps, there will be questioning. They never found that any of those people had done anything or were part of any conspiracy. But these Japanese American citizens were forced. When they left their homes, they were only basically allowed to bring what they could carry from their homes. They had to leave their businesses, their houses, and everything behind. They weren't to get any compensation for leaving behind their homes and their businesses. Other people will come in and take those. And you can kind of see, here's some pictures from these relocation centers. The people who were put in these relocation centers really tried to make it, to make their lives as, normal as they could, as positive as they could. It was really difficult. They were in these, barracks right here. You can see here some kids who are playing football. This is showing that relocation. These are Japanese American citizens who are being relocated. You can see that they are trying to carry as much of their stuff with them as they can. This is one of the camps, so you can kind of see what this looks like. These camps are going to be in places like Nevada, Idaho, Utah, and if you haven't ever been to any of where these places are, Wyoming, they were out in the middle, mostly of the deserts. It was extremely barren, super hot and dry in the summer, and it gets really cold in the winter time. There's one in Idaho that you can go out, and they open it occasionally for tours. That's what it would have looked like. So question, which executive order forced the relocation of Japanese Americans into relocation centers? A. Executive Order 5067. B. Executive Order 9066. Which executive order forced the relocation of Japanese Americans into relocation centers? Your next question. Japanese Americans relocated during World War II were given back money and their homes after the war. So were they compensated or given money for what they had lost, their houses, their homes, their businesses? A. True. B. False. So now we talked a little bit about Executive Order 9066 and Japanese Americans being relocated and not getting that compensation when they came back. They just basically lost everything. So what about other minorities? Well, we're going to take a moment and talk about women in World War II. And the government realized very quickly that they needed women to help with the war effort. And so, we talked about how in the 20s, women were really showing that independence, getting that, really pushing to get equality. And in the 30s, we kind of saw where there was more of a push for women to stay at home, focusing on that mother, being a mother again and a wife. Well, as the war started, the U.S. government realized with all of these men going off to war, they needed someone to take their place. And so the U.S. government is actually going to start a propaganda campaign to bring women into the workforce. The whole focus of this propaganda, or trying to sway public opinion, is to show people that women should work outside of the home and that women should be involved in this war effort also. And so because of this, women are actually able to get into better jobs, and actually some new jobs that women had never been able to get into before. They were able to get better pay and better working conditions. And this was because of this push by the U.S. government for women to enter into the workforce. So here's, you can see, here's a little bit of propaganda. If you can drive a car, you can run a machine, trying to really tell women that they can do anything. Women maybe might have said, oh, I don't know how to run that. And they're like, yeah, you can do this. It's not that hard. Here's, why do we need women workers? You can't build ships, guns, and planes without them. So you can see women started to build all of these things. The military is actually going to create divisions for women within the military also to help them help with the workforce. You can see Rosie the Riveter, one of the most famous icons from World War II, and her famous "We Can Do It." You'll notice that Rosie is wearing overalls. She's showing how tough she is. This is real propaganda from the government, showing women to kind of change from that idea of just being wives and mothers into being this valuable part of the workforce, and to really get out and do all of these things. Just some more propaganda, trying to get women recruited as nurses, saying don't just sit around and wait for your man to come home, get out there, get a war job. Once again, finding your war job. You'll see the women are all, their hair's up, they're all wearing coveralls, having those real strong poses. This is even going to work for women who were farmers at the time. You can see join the Women's Land Army, basically really helping to push women to take over farms or to work on farms, while their husbands or dads are away. There was a focus on women in all parts of the U.S., rural and in urban. There's Rosie again. You can see these are women who are working, building ships, they're building machines, they're building the supplies that the military needed to keep up its war effort. Once again, this is the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. It was also formed to help meet additional labor needs. This is going to be women who work in non-combat positions within the Army. Now, if you were living at home during World War II, what the government did was they started issuing ration coupons, because the government knew that the people serving overseas needed a lot of food and they needed a lot of supplies. And so the government is going to take and begin to ration or limit the amount of supplies and different types of food and things that the people back in the United States could have. And so some of those are going to be gas, coffee, sugar, tires, meats. And so you're going to would get these ration cards, which would say you can get this much gas per month, or you can get this much coffee per month. And you would have to take that down to the store, and that's how you could buy coffee and things. You can see this is a ration book. And once you used all of that, you couldn't go back and buy more, even if you had the money. So there was a lot of rationing. The idea was that people at home wouldn't have as much, so that they could give that instead to the militaries fighting overseas. People are also going to plan what they call victory gardens. That the idea was to help combat food shortages. You're going to see kids in schools. They would actually take some of the playground areas and they would turn those into gardens, parks on top of apartment buildings. They really were pushing this idea of making these gardens. You can see here's some more propaganda from the U.S. The United States government is really going to push war bonds. Basically, this is you kind of investing in the war effort. People were really afraid in the United States following Pearl Harbor that there were spies all over, and so there was a lot of push, to make sure that people didn't say things or talk about things that they weren't supposed to. So you would have seen this loose lips might sink ships a lot. Cartoons were a really big part also of the war effort. A lot of propaganda. You will see like Superman cartoons, Walt Disney cartoons, like Donald Duck cartoons, Mickey Mouse. There are cartoons that are during this time that are full of propaganda supporting the war effort. So as we move on and we're talking about minorities, African Americans are also going to see in the United States the ability to get more rights, better jobs, better pay, and also be able to go into areas that African Americans previous to this weren't allowed to go into as far as like jobs. And this is going to be, once again, that need for workers is going to push industries to begin to hire African Americans when maybe they weren't going to before. In fact, FDR is actually going to force companies who refused to hire African Americans before this to hire them. Just to show you how effective this was, during World War II, the employment of African Americans is going to double. For those African Americans who wanted to sign up to fight in the military, they were still going to be forced in the beginning of World War II to fight in all-black units. You will see African Americans in the military that are not in all-black units, that they're going to be in non-combat positions primarily, as the United States military was still segregated at this point. One of the most famous is going to be the Tuskegee Airmen. This was African American fighter pilots, and they're going to be extremely effective. They're really going to push African American rights in the military because they're so successful. They will destroy over 400 enemy aircraft by the end of the war. So very successful, showing that African Americans deserved those jobs. African Americans, women, are not going to be the only minorities that are really going to be put into the workforce. Mexican Americans are also going to fight not only in the battles during fighting in the military in World War II, but also they are going to be working on farms. In fact, the government is going to allow a lot of Mexican citizens to come into the United States to work on American farms to help the United States get those supplies that they needed. Those workers are going to be called braceros. So now we're going to talk about Native Americans and what an important part they played in World War II. 1 out of 3 Native Americans will serve in World War II. That's higher than any other minority group. One of these groups, one of the most famous groups, is a group called the Navajo Code Talkers. These are going to be Navajo men who joined the war effort, and what they did was the United States was looking for some type of code or language which to talk to each other, but that the enemies couldn't understand or couldn't break. And that was really important because you want to be able to send messages to people without your enemies finding out who it was. So what they decided was the U.S. government decided to use Navajo, the language of the Navajos. And so these men that were Navajo actually, they came up with this code, and it was never broken. And that's unheard of. The Japanese tried to break it all the time, and they could never break it. And so the Navajo code talkers were extremely important in World War II. So question, true or false? Many ethnic American minorities fought in World War II. A, true. B, false. Many ethnic American minorities fought in World War II. And that's where we will end for today.